Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the help we need most can come from where we least expect it? Imagine being alone, surrounded by unseeing eyes, footsteps that pass you by endlessly, voices that drift away as if your problem didn't exist. It's as if the whole world has decided your pain doesn't deserve attention. And then, in the midst of this heavy silence and this suffocating emptiness, someone appears. But this someone isn't a person, it's a stray dog. An animal that theoretically has nothing to offer but itself, and yet in that moment it offers everything. The whole world ignored him, except for a stray dog. This phrase may sound poetic, but the story behind it is real and powerful. Perhaps you've experienced something similar, a moment when it seemed like no one was willing to lend a hand. Perhaps you still remember how your chest tightens and your mind fills with questions. Why doesn't anyone see? Do I really not matter? It's a feeling that stirs the soul, that tests our faith in people and in life. But in this case, the one who broke the mold wasn't a human, a longtime friend, or a well-meaning stranger passing by. It was a dog without an owner, without a leash, without a home, but with something many have lost, the sensitivity to recognize that someone needed help. And that sensitivity made all the difference. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this isn't just a story about friendship between a human and an animal. It's about instinct, about connection, about how a simple gesture can mean the line between despair and hope. Picture it with me. The scene is one of abandonment. People come and go, concerned only with their own commitments. A young man stands still, visibly lost, vulnerable, perhaps even a little scared. He looks around searching for something or someone who might change the situation, but eyes shift, steps quicken, hands remain in pockets. The cold of the concrete seems to penetrate your body. It's the kind of moment when even the air feels heavier, as if it wants to push you down. And then in the midst of this indifferent routine, a movement catches our attention. It's not a scream, it's not a human touch. It's the sound of paws hitting the ground, firm but light. It's a gaze that doesn't waver, a snout that approaches as if to say, I see you. Does it seem small? Perhaps to those who have never felt the weight of loneliness, it does. But to those at the bottom of an emotional well, it's enormous. Have you ever been there, feeling like everyone around you is too busy to notice what you're going through, and then suddenly something or someone breaks that cycle and gives you back some of your strength? That's the kind of experience that leaves a lasting impression, and that's exactly what we'll explore in this story, because that stray dog didn't just come closer, he stayed. He remained there, vigilant, as if he knew his presence was needed, and that simple decision changed everything. Many people might think, but it's just an animal, it can't do much. That's where the mistake lies. Animals don't calculate actions like we do. They don't analyze the cost-benefit before acting. They feel, and in that moment, this dog sensed something everyone else ignored. He sensed vulnerability, danger, and decided to act, without expecting anything in return, without knowing what would come next. And this decision, so instinctive, ended up being an act of courage and empathy that few humans would have at that moment. As the young man tried to understand what was happening, the dog positioned itself protectively, as if to say to the world, now he's not alone anymore. The contrast was stark. A being invisible to everyone suddenly became the center of attention and protection of another being, one who didn't even speak the same language, but who understood far more than any words could express. Stay with me until the end, because from this unlikely encounter, a sequence of events began to unfold, revealing that even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of light. A light that sometimes comes not from the hands we expect, but from paws that carry a silent strength. And it is precisely in this unlikely turn of events that the beauty of this story lies. Now, I want to take you deeper into this scenario, so you can feel every detail and understand how a simple act, ignored by many but embraced by one, can transform not just a day, but an entire life. And it's impossible not to think about how many times in life we experience moments like these, when a single action completely changes the course of history. Perhaps, as you listen to this, you've already remembered a situation where someone unexpectedly reached out to you. Or perhaps you were the one who did it for someone else. These stories have an incredible power to connect us, because they show that, even in a rushed and often indifferent world, there are still gestures that make all the difference. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far. It could be a thought, a memory, or even a short phrase. I read every comment, and that's how we build a community of people who believe in empathy and transformation. And if you enjoy this kind of story and want to continue following inspiring and moving content, subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what makes this space grow and reach more people who need to hear messages like this. Oh, and if you feel this story deserves to be shared with more people, leave a like. It's a simple gesture, but it goes a long way toward keeping this work alive. Because in the end, every interaction you have here isn't just a number, it's a sign that these stories still matter. And that's precisely what reminds us that what we're about to see next is even more valuable. He wasn't someone who drew attention wherever he went. He wasn't famous, nor did he have a life full of adventures or extraordinary achievements. He was an ordinary young man in his early 20s who divided his time between a simple job and a few hours of study at night. He woke up early, took the same bus, sat almost always in the same place, and followed a routine that seemed immutable. He had dreams, of course he did, but they were always tucked away in his back pocket, waiting for the right moment to be lived. Like many people, he believed that life was something that would actually happen at some point in the future, when conditions were perfect. The apartment he lived in was small, with furniture inherited from relatives and signs of age on the walls. It wasn't a bad place, but it didn't convey that welcoming, homey feeling either. Silence filled the space more than anything else. Between work and college, he hardly had visitors, and loneliness had become part of the landscape. Still, he carried on. He didn't complain much because he believed everyone carries some kind of burden, and his was no different. Little by little, this predictable life began to create a kind of emotional numbness. The days passed so similarly that it was difficult to recall a recent moment that had truly changed something within him. Conversations were short, interactions limited. He was the kind of person who, if he were absent from a place, few would notice. And, deep down, that was the part that hurt the most. Not the absence of major events, but the absence of feeling seen. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to dream, he imagined living somewhere else, working in something truly meaningful, meeting new people, but the distance between the life he had and the life he wanted seemed too great. And when this distance is constant, it begins to affect your mindset. You start to believe that certain things simply aren't for you. This is one of the hidden truths of routine. It can be so comfortable, even in its mediocrity, that it prevents you from seeking any transformation. It was at this stage of his life that everything happened. He wasn't experiencing intense drama or a crisis visible to everyone, but he was carrying a silent weariness, the kind of exhaustion that isn't measured in hours of sleep, but in how many times you've swallowed what you wanted to say so as not to upset anyone. And it was precisely in this state that the unexpected appeared, not as a brilliant opportunity or an invitation to change his life, but as an unlikely encounter that began almost banally. The day in question was unremarkable. He'd gone out to run a quick errand, walking the same streets as always, distracted by his own thoughts. He remembered staring at the ground, thinking about the month's bills and the amount of tasks he'd piled up. The sky was overcast, and the cold wind made it feel like the entire city was in a hurry to hide somewhere warm, and as usual, no one seemed to notice anyone. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this feeling of invisibility is more common than it seems. We're not just talking about being ignored by strangers on the street, but an emotional pattern that sets in when we spend too much time without meaningful connections. It's a silent internal journey in which decisions begin to be made not out of a desire to grow, but out of a fear of failure. When this happens, any gesture of attention, from anywhere, takes on immense weight. And that's why, when he noticed that unexpected movement on the street corner, he didn't immediately understand what was happening. A stray dog, seemingly aimless, was coming toward him with a look that conveyed more curiosity than caution. There was no leash, no rush, just a slow approach, as if the animal knew it needed to be there. It was one of those moments when something simple interrupts the automatic flow of the mind. He stopped. The dog did too. There was a moment of silent exchange, as if each recognized some kind of familiarity in the other. No words were needed, no grand gestures, just presence. And for someone accustomed to going unnoticed, being noticed, even by a dog, meant much more than it seemed at first glance. This was the first step in a chain of events that gradually dispelled his emotional numbness and reignited something he hadn't even realized he still had. A minor detail to any outside observer, But for him, it represented a spark capable of changing the entire course of history. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The cold wind seemed to pierce through his thin coat, but it wasn't just the weather that chilled him. It was the feeling of being completely alone, even among so many people. He walked slower than usual, as if his own weight had doubled, and he stopped every now and then to look around, almost instinctively, hoping someone would notice. But their gazes, when they met his, were quick and empty, looking away as if there was something more urgent to see. Cars passed, horns honked, voices mingled in hurried conversations, but none of it had anything to do with him. It was as if he was surrounded by an invisible wall, the kind of barrier that doesn't physically impede approach, but keeps you away simply because no one wants to cross it. A woman passed a few steps away, adjusting her scarf, but not even lifting her head to look. Two men, laughing at something on their cell phones, discreetly moved to the sidewalk to avoid swerving too close to him. A mother, holding her daughter's hand, quickened her pace as he tried wordlessly to convey a plea for help with his gaze. There was no shouting, no obvious drama. It was the kind of situation that gets lost in the daily rush, but that corrodes inside. This is the hidden truth about indifference. It's not loud, it's not blatant, and that's precisely why it's so difficult to combat. The lack of reaction, of contact, of empathy can be more devastating than any harsh words. He knew he wasn't okay, but it seemed no one else cared. The chill of the streets didn't just come from the wind, it came from the way each face passed without paying attention, how each step sounded more distant than the last. And no matter how hard he tried to hide it, his posture betrayed it. Shoulders slumped slightly, hands trembling in his pockets, a gaze fixed more on the ground than on the horizon. It was the portrait of someone trying to stay upright, while the world around him moved too fast to notice. And what hurt most wasn't the lack of direct help, but the silent confirmation that he wasn't part of that hurried machine. It was as if there was an invisible code that said, "Don't look, don't get involved, don't waste time." This mentality, which so many carry without realizing it, creates a cruel distance. The decisions to ignore accumulate like layers, and soon it's no longer an isolated case, but a pattern. He wasn't the first, and certainly wouldn't be the last, to cross a crowded street, feeling as if he were in a desert. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when we talk about impact and transformation, it's not just about big events. Often, change begins the moment someone breaks this cycle of indifference. A single action can break the automatic rhythm of hundreds of hurried steps and create a moment of real connection, and that's where stories gain power, because they reveal that the difference isn't in the size of the gesture, but in the fact that it exists. He was about to give up on finding any sign of humanity that day. His body, already tired, searched for a place to stop for a few minutes, perhaps a bench, perhaps a corner sheltered from the wind. He passed the entrance to a store, but the security guard at the door gave a slight shake of his head, indicating that this was not a good place to stay. He returned to the sidewalk and continued walking, with no clear destination, simply letting his feet decide where to go. It was during this slow movement that as he turned a corner, he noticed a different look in his eyes. It wasn't someone busy with their cell phone, nor someone with a distant expression. It was direct, fixed, curious. Small movements accompanied that gaze. A timid step, then another, a measured approach. There was no judgment, no rush. And for the first time that day, he felt like he was being seen. The approaching figure wore no elegant clothes, no sign of status. I wasn't carrying shopping bags. I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. It was just a stray dog, with shaggy fur and the marks of time. But in that moment, that detail didn't matter. What mattered was that there was a presence there that didn't turn away, that didn't pass by, that didn't pretend not to notice. And it's curious how life sometimes chooses behind the scenes to present its greatest revelations. There were no words exchanged, no rational explanation for that encounter. There was only the simple fact that, while everyone else chose to ignore it, a being living on the margins decided to stop. And as small as it may seem, for someone who had been invisible until then, it meant everything. Right there. I'm on this journey too. The dog appeared unhurried, yet carried a purpose even he couldn't explain. He was medium-sized, with a coat of mixed shades of brown and black, marked by knots and small gaps that betrayed his time on the streets. His gaze, however, was what caught the most attention. There was no fear nor distrust, just a calm curiosity, as if trying to decipher who was in front of him. His posture was firm, but not threatening. His tail wagged slightly, not in a way of celebration, but of recognition, as if silently saying, "I know you need me, even if you don't realize it yet." He stopped and for a moment forgot the cold and the weight of loneliness. The presence of that dog who owed him nothing carried a strange sense of welcome. There was no exchange of interests, no meeting motivated by obligation or convenience. It was pure instinct, and this instinct, which so many underestimate, has an incredible ability to penetrate invisible barriers. The dog came closer, without asking permission, but also without intruding. He nuzzled his leg and took a deep breath, as if trying to memorize that moment. There was no leash, no owner nearby. Just two lives that, until a few minutes before, had been following completely different trajectories, and now, somehow, met in the same place. The city continued its hurried pace, but in that small space, time seemed to have slowed down. The young man bent down, still somewhat hesitant, and ran his hand over the rough fur. He felt the texture, sensed the animal's body temperature, and along with it, he sensed something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was a spark of hope. Maybe it was just the reminder that I wasn't completely invisible. The contact, even silent, carried enormous emotional weight. It wasn't just a physical gesture. It was confirmation that there was indeed a space in the world where he could still be seen. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because encounters like these aren't just pretty coincidences to recount later. They have a real impact on mentality. When someone or something breaks the logic of indifference and reaches out, a new emotional reference point is created. It's as if, from that moment on, a part of the brain is reprogrammed to believe that connection is still possible. And when we believe this, future decisions begin to change. This is where the silent transformation begins, one that we often don't even notice immediately. The dog remained by his side, oblivious to all the activity around him. A couple passed by talking loudly. A cyclist swerved on the sidewalk, but nothing seemed capable of distracting him. Every now and then, he glanced at the young man and then back at the street, as if assessing the scene, ready to react to anything. And this spontaneous alertness brought a feeling he hadn't felt that day: security, something he hadn't felt since leaving home. It was curious to think that amidst so many people, the only presence willing to stop and pay attention was a nameless, addressless animal. There was no way to predict what would come next, but in that moment, the mere fact of not being alone changed everything. Small doses of courage began to seep almost imperceptibly into the way he breathed, his posture, the way he looked around. Perhaps to outsiders, he was just a man standing with a dog, but to those inside, it was much more than that. It was the beginning of a journey he never imagined he would experience, one marked by decisions made possible only by this unlikely encounter. Comment there. That makes sense to me. The dog remained close, alert to every movement around him, as if he knew this was no ordinary moment. His eyes swept the street from side to side, and his previously relaxed body took on a firmer stance, almost like a silent guard. Then, in the distance, something changed. A man was walking quickly, with stiff steps and a fixed gaze. It didn't seem like a chance encounter. There was something about the way he approached that immediately raised an alarm. The young man didn't notice at first, lost in his own thoughts, but the dog did. The hairs on his back stood on end, his breathing deepened, and a low growl escaped him as a warning. He took a step forward, positioning himself between the young man and the direction the man was coming from. There was no hesitation. There was no fear. It was pure instinct, guided by something that needs no words: the perception of danger. The man slowed down when he noticed the animal's presence, perhaps calculating whether to continue or change course. The dog kept its gaze fixed, motionless, as if ready to leap if necessary, and suddenly the young man understood. This wasn't just a curious dog who had decided to accompany him for a few minutes. It was someone who, inexplicably, had taken on a responsibility for him. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because there's a hidden truth about protection. It often comes from where we least expect it, and when it does, it transforms our mindset. Until then, the young man had seen himself as invisible, someone who could navigate any situation without anyone intervening. But in that moment, that vision began to crumble. It was no longer just about being alone or ignored. It was about discovering that, even without prior ties, someone could stand between him and a potential threat. The man eventually swerved to the other side of the street, and the tension visible in the dog's body relaxed. Still, the dog didn't move away. He took 2 steps back but remained close, as if to ensure the situation was truly under control. The young man, for his part, felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. It was strange to think that, if not for that nameless animal, he might have faced something much worse. From that moment on, the walk ceased to be merely a physical movement. It became a silent journey, charged with meaning. Each step alongside the dog seemed to reinforce a message: you are not unprotected. And this, for someone who had been accumulating days of solitude and indifference, was almost a revelation. Small details began to stand out. The way the dog looked back every few meters, making sure he was following, or the way he chose the side of the sidewalk with less traffic, guiding the path almost imperceptibly. It was as if the animal understood that it wasn't enough to ward off danger once. There was a need to remain, to ensure that this improvised security would last a little longer, and in a way, this constancy had an even greater impact than the initial moment of protection. Because it wasn't an isolated reaction, it was a sustained behavior. In the young man's mind, a series of thoughts intertwined. He couldn't help but think about how small decisions shape our paths. The dog could have simply continued on its way, ignoring his presence, just as everyone else had done that day. But no, at some point, that animal had made the decision to stop and approach. It had made the decision to intervene when something seemed wrong. And now it was making the decision to stay. These decisions, even if instinctive, have the power to redefine the course of a story. And in this case, they marked the beginning of an unlikely bond, built without words, but with clear gestures. The young man didn't know how long it would last, but he felt there was something to learn from that spontaneous loyalty. Something about how protection isn't always planned, but when it happens, it has the power to change our perception of the world and of ourselves. Right there, I'm on this journey too. The street seemed to follow its normal rhythm, but something was different. The young man felt an almost imperceptible shift in the air, as if the silence between sounds had grown heavier. The dog, which had been walking beside him, stopped abruptly. Its ears pricked up, its body stiffened, and its eyes fixed on a specific point ahead. It was as if everything else had ceased to exist for him. The young man followed the animal's gaze, and only then did he realize. On the other side of the corner, a car was speeding along with no intention of braking. It wasn't a wide avenue, but a narrow street, where drivers normally drove slowly. The detail that froze the moment was realizing that just ahead, there was a nearly blind intersection, and a group of people were beginning to cross without the slightest idea of what was coming. It all happened too quickly for anyone to process rationally. The young man felt his heart race, but before he could take a step, the dog lunged, not toward the car, but in a calculated move to push him back, as if to remove him from harm's way. It was at that moment that he realized it was no coincidence that the animal had stopped right next to him from the start. There was a kind of silent connection there, and somehow the dog had sensed the danger before he did. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because it's in these moments that we understand the true impact of quick, instinctive decisions. Until that moment, the young man had been immersed in his own routine of thoughts, unaware of what was approaching. This is how many of us live, too focused on internal problems to notice external threats, and sometimes it takes something or someone from the outside to break through this barrier of distraction and bring us back to the present moment. This is one of the most important revelations of this journey. The danger we face isn't always immediately apparent. The driver, realizing too late that there was someone in front of him, braked sharply, but not enough to avoid the chaos. The sound of tires scraping against the asphalt echoed through the street, mixed with the frightened cries of those crossing. The young man stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to comprehend the scene, until he felt the dog's body brush against his leg again, as if checking to see if he was truly okay. This silent exchange in that context carried enormous weight. It wasn't just about escaping an accident. It was about recognizing that, had he been alone, he might not have even realized the risk in time. It was about understanding that this unlikely encounter had just taken on new meaning. What began as a simple gesture of closeness now transformed into a physical barrier against danger. The group of people hurried across, some looking back with confused expressions, but no one stopped to ask if he was okay. And that's when a thought crossed his mind. How many times have we passed someone on the edge and kept walking, never imagining that we could be the difference between safety and disaster? This hidden truth is disturbing because it shows that most of the time, what prevents tragedy is not the presence of many, but the actions of a few. The dog remained alert, still looking at the intersection, as if calculating whether the danger had truly passed. His tail was low but not in fear. It was pure concentration. Gradually he relaxed and resumed walking, making sure the young man followed him. And with each step, the impact of that moment became clearer. This wasn't just a stray who had chosen to accompany him. This was someone who had instinctively assumed the role of guardian, asking nothing in return. The young man felt his body light and heavy at the same time. Light from having escaped something serious, heavy from understanding how everything had hung by a thread. This mixture of sensations, though uncomfortable, also brought a different kind of clarity, the clarity that life can change in seconds and that often we don't decide when that second will arrive, but we can decide how we will react to it and what we will learn from it, right there. This makes sense to me. The dog seemed to have taken command of the situation, as if fully aware of what needed to be done. As soon as he realized the danger wasn't completely averted, he barked. Not a common bark, one expressing anxiety or play, but a firm, deep, and precise sound, full of warning. People around him even turned to see what was happening, and that alone made a difference. Their previously scattered attention was now focused on that spot, creating a small, invisible barrier of alertness and caution. The young man, still a little confused, felt the dog press its body against his leg, pushing him gently, as if to guide him to a safer place. And that's exactly what it did. It chose a side path, skirting the street, and pacing with a determined rhythm, without hesitation. There was something almost human in that gesture, as if it knew the priority was to ward off danger, even though the immediate risk had already passed. With each advance, the dog looked back to check if he was following. And it wasn't just surveillance. There was a connection there, a kind of silent communication that dispensed with words. The young man, no matter how hard he tried to understand it rationally, knew it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a decision. The dog had chosen to act, to intervene, to change the course of that moment. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic because there's a huge emotional impact when we realize someone or something decides to stand between us and a threat. This kind of attitude changes our mindset because it shows in a practical way that we're not as alone as we imagine. It breaks that hidden truth we so often carry, that, in the end, no one will care. When someone who lives on the margins of human attention does this, the effect is even more powerful. It's as if the world is telling us that the value of life isn't tied to social position, status, or power, but to the ability to act courageously at the right moment. The young man began to notice every detail, the way the dog held his head high, alert to any sudden movement, the way he slowed his pace when he sensed he was falling behind, the way he always positioned himself slightly ahead, as if to test the waters first. It was pure protection, with no reward in sight, and this, for someone coming from days marked by indifference, was almost a revelation. As they moved away from the threat, their pace began to slow. The dog slowed, looked at the young man and paused for a moment as if to confirm he was okay. It was in that brief pause that the real impact of the situation began to sink in. It wasn't just about having prevented an accident or a potential attack. It was about the significance of someone, even a four-legged stranger, deciding you're worth the effort, worth the intervention, worth the risk. This decision, made in seconds, reconfigures something within us. Confidence, which may have been extinguished, begins to rekindle. The sense of security, which seemed distant, returns, even if only for a moment. And this can be the first step toward a deeper transformation, one that isn't immediately noticeable, but that shapes the way we view future situations in life. The young man took a deep breath and realized that, amidst the tension, he had learned something important about quick decisions. The dog didn't stop to consider consequences, didn't calculate risks and benefits. He simply reacted to what felt right. This simplicity is something that, paradoxically, many humans lose along the way. Life teaches us to ponder, to hesitate, to seek reassurance before acting. But sometimes what truly saves is immediate action, guided by a clear sense of purpose. The path they walked now seemed calmer, but the bond they had created there remained undimmed. The young man knew that gesture would remain etched in his memory, not only as a moment of danger averted, but as a symbol that there is still room for genuine gestures in an increasingly distracted world. And as they walked side by side, the certainty grew. That dog had done more than just physically protect him. He had restored a piece of humanity that was missing. Comment there. That makes sense to me. His first impulse was to simply stop. His body seemed unsure whether it wanted to cry, laugh, or just take a deep breath and let everything settle. His heart was still pounding, as if reminding him that minutes earlier the outcome could have been completely different. The dog, on the other hand, was calmer, but not so relaxed as to move away. He remained nearby, watching, as if certain the mission wasn't over yet. It was then that he felt his eyes well up. It wasn't a cry of sadness, nor an outpouring of anger. It was the release of a weight that had been building up long before that moment of danger. The tears carried more than fear. They carried the feeling of being seen, protected, and, in a way, chosen. It was a kind of emotion difficult to explain because it wasn't just tied to what had happened, but to the meaning behind the dog's gesture. He bent down, running his hand slowly through the rough fur, and realized that the touch was more of a thank you than a caress. It didn't matter if the animal understood words. The gesture was the message, and in the look he received back, there was a quiet calm, as if the dog were saying everything was under control. There was no rush to leave, no indifference, just presence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because moments like these have an impact that goes beyond the situation itself. There's something transformative about being rescued, not just physically, but emotionally. When someone, without any obligation, decides to stand between you and danger, the effect is immediate. Your view of yourself and the world begins to shift. It's as if, for a moment, all internal narratives of loneliness and invisibility are interrupted to make way for a new possibility. That genuine connections are still possible, even in the most unexpected forms. The young man stood there for a few minutes, simply trying to find balance between what had just happened and the life that existed before. It was strange to think that, until that encounter, he had no expectations about the day. It was just another date on the calendar, destined to be lost in the repetition of other days. But now, something had changed. And this change wasn't just about being alive. It was about being aware that life can completely change with a single gesture. People continued to pass by, some curious, some indifferent, but none of that mattered to him anymore. The scene was just him and the dog, as if they'd created a small, invisible space where the rest of the world didn't interfere. It was a momentary refuge, but one that left deep scars. He didn't know if he could put his feelings into words, and perhaps it wasn't even necessary. The truth is, some experiences are something we can't describe. We carry them with us. When he finally stood up, the dog followed him without hesitation. There was no collar, leash, or remote control. It was a mutual decision to walk together for a few more steps, as if they both understood the story wasn't over yet. And as they walked, he began to notice details that would have previously gone unnoticed. The sound of paws on the asphalt, the way the sun filtered through the buildings, the smell of bread coming from a nearby bakery. Small things that suddenly took on significance. It was as if the rescue had done more than prevent an accident. It had reactivated his perception of what truly matters. And this was perhaps the greatest revelation of all. When life offers you a second chance, be it big or small, the world around you begins to take on new colors. What once seemed automatic now carries meaning. And that doesn't fade easily. The bond between them, even built in such a short time, already had the solidity of something unbound by convention. There were no promises, no expectations, but there was something essential: trust. And for someone who had lived without expecting much from anyone, this trust was almost a gift. It didn't matter how long it would last. What mattered was that it existed there, in that moment. Comment there. I'm on this journey too. The days that followed didn't return to their previous rhythm. It was impossible for them to return. The young man, accustomed to walking the streets as if passing through a faded landscape, now noticed every detail with a new awareness, not because the city had changed, but because something inside him had transformed. The presence of that dog, even if silent, had triggered a kind of emotional alert that made him see the world differently. The curious thing is that the dog kept showing up. It wasn't like an animal you officially adopt and take home the same day. He would show up in the morning, sometimes waiting near the gate, sometimes on the way to work, as if he knew exactly where and when to find him. There was no ownership, but there was a bond. It was as if they had made an unspoken agreement. As long as I can, I'll be around. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this kind of connection isn't measured solely by how long or how often it occurs. What developed between them was a kind of emotional pact, born from a moment of extreme need and maintained by the trust that arose from it. This trust wasn't one-sided. The young man also began to notice when the dog needed something, some food, a place to rest, even a look of recognition. It was a genuine exchange without formal obligations, but with a real impact on the routine and mindset of both. The hidden truth, which we often ignore, is that the most profound transformation rarely comes from planned situations. It happens when life forces us to stop and reconsider what truly matters. That encounter hadn't just saved the young man from physical danger. It had rescued a part of him that had been dormant. And similarly for the dog, that human wasn't just another figure among many passing by. He had become a fixed point in an uncertain world, someone worth returning to. The impact went beyond the walks together. The young man began to notice changes in his own decisions. Before, he avoided interactions, kept conversations to a minimum, and rarely engaged with strangers. Now, there was a greater openness. He found himself looking people in the eye more often, paying attention to details, recognizing expressions that had previously gone unnoticed. It was as if the dog's lesson, to be present and act at the right moment, had infiltrated his daily actions. The dog, in turn, seemed to have adopted a different attitude toward the space around him, always alert, but also more confident, as if he knew he now had an ally. Even though he lived much of the time on the streets, he was no longer just a solitary survivor. There was a sense of belonging, albeit temporary, and this changed the way he moved, the way he observed, and even the way he interacted with others. The behind the scenes of this relationship was simple yet powerful. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic moments every day, but there was consistency, and this consistency built something neither of them could name, but both felt. They were, in some way, part of each other's journey, and this created a domino effect. Small actions began to spread. A neighbor who saw the dog following the young man began leaving water at the door. A merchant began saving pieces of bread and meat for when they passed by. People previously indifferent began to notice, and in noticing became involved. It was as if that bond had the power to open spaces for other connections. The young man realized with each passing day that it wasn't just him who had changed. The dog, too, showed signs of transformation. His gaze, which had initially carried the caution of someone always ready to flee, now had moments of rest. His posture, previously always alert, now found opportunities to relax beside him, lie at his feet, and simply remain. And in this remaining, there was more strength than in any grand gesture. This life-changing experience wasn't made up of grand milestones, but of subtle repetitions that, combined, rewrote the way they both existed in the world. And for someone who had felt invisible for so long, being in a relationship where being seen felt natural and reciprocated was an incalculable gift. Comment there. That makes sense to me. Sometimes life presents us with silent trials, moments when solitude seems to be the only company, and the indifference around us seems to confirm that no one will notice if something happens. And it is precisely in these moments that, almost poetically, the most unlikely heroes emerge. They don't arrive with capes, they don't have rehearsed speeches, nor do they enter the scene with background music. Sometimes they arrive with light steps, attentive eyes, and a heart that cannot ignore what it feels. That's exactly how that dog entered the young man's life, promising nothing, but delivering everything. The most surprising thing is that the impact wasn't limited to the moment of rescue. His presence was like a seed planted in soil that until then seemed infertile. And like any seed, it took time, repetition, and small interactions to grow. The transformation that began there was not only emotional, but also mental. The young man began to see the world differently, to be less suspicious and more observant, and to make room for the unexpected. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic because the central lesson of this story goes far beyond an act of protection. It's about understanding that courage and empathy aren't restricted to those with resources, titles, or social recognition. They often come from those living on the margins, from those with nothing to lose, or perhaps from those who have already lost so much that they've learned to value what little remains. The dog had no compulsion to act, but he did. And in doing so, he proved that when a decision is guided by the instinct to protect, there is no hierarchy between who can and cannot be a hero. The young man began to realize that life's greatest revelations rarely come with warning. There's no way to schedule the moment we'll encounter something or someone that will change our trajectory. Life has this ability to transform the backstage into the main stage, to take an ordinary scene and in a matter of seconds, imbue it with meaning. The day that began like any other ended as a milestone, not because there were major material changes, but because his mindset was never the same again. The dog, for his part, may not have been aware of the role he played, but his posture made it clear that the encounter had also affected him. Each day as they met, there was a silent exchange, a mutual recognition that said, "I know who you are and what you've done for me." This relationship, built on trust and presence, became a living reminder that true connections don't require complex explanations, just authenticity. The hidden truth here is that when we allow ourselves to receive help, even from unexpected sources, we expand our capacity to give. The young man, who had previously avoided interactions, now found himself more willing to notice those around him, to offer a smile, to do small acts of kindness. It was as if the dog's act had ignited a chain of positive impact that spread beyond the two of them. Small gestures that, though discreet, carried the same essence, being present for others. This journey made a powerful lesson clear. Heroes don't follow a mold. It's not size, shape, or origin that defines someone as a hero, but rather the willingness to act when no one else will. And that day, it was a stray dog who carried out this mission. He didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for recognition, and didn't set conditions. He simply did what needed to be done. And in that act, he proved that greatness often lies in gestures that go unnoticed by most, but change everything for those who receive them. The young man never looked at a stray dog the same way again. He never again saw a stranger without remembering that behind any appearance there can be a story and a heart willing to act. And that's something you can't unlearn. It's a lasting mark, one that shapes future decisions, one that redefines priorities. Because deep down we all have the capacity to be that kind of hero for someone, even if at the time we don't even realize it. Comment there. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, I think this story has already spoken for itself. And if it resonated with you, if it touched you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm with you until the end. It's my way of knowing who really walked with me until the very last second, and believe me, I read them all. If you want to continue receiving stories like this, which inspire, move, and show that humanity still exists in the most unlikely places, subscribe to the channel. This is what keeps this space alive and allows us to create more content that makes a difference in your day. Oh, and leave your like, because it's a clear sign that this connection we've created here is worth it. And since you're here, there's no need to stop now. There's a video right here that complements this topic in a special way. Click and continue with me there.